What's up, folks? Justin Garcia, aka Master Chim here, with the breakdown of the Askren-Lawler finish last night in UFC 235. Full disclosure, I am a tremendous Ben Askren fan, but also worth noting, I am also a tremendous Robbie Lawler fan. So, whereas I do look to see Ben Askren, I'm looking forward to seeing him do well in the UFC. We're waiting for him to get to the UFC for a while now. I do not consider myself inherently biased against Robbie Lawler or pro Askren that would undermine my take on this finish. So the controversy seems to be that it was a bad stoppage, right? So bad stoppage. So I'm actually going to go here to the finish of the fight, and let me run this. Right, and this is the video that I had uploaded on social media before, right? So we see the choke, we see his hand drop, we see Herb Dean come in, we see it stopped. Choke, hand drops. Choke, hand drops, right? So worth mentioning, right, is, well, if we're saying it's a bad stoppage, what does that mean? So does bad stoppage mean that it was anticlimactic? Does it mean that it is bad for MMA? Does it mean that it was illegal, therefore illegitimate? Does it mean that in the grand scope of what was available in terms of options, Herb Dean chose the worst one, right? So I think first, to get terms right, to say it's a bad stoppage, we have to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. Now, I will say that I feel it is a legitimate stoppage, 100% legitimate stoppage. But I could also say that I consider it to be a bad stoppage, in that it could have played out many different ways. It played out in the one that was the least entertaining to me, right? So it was bad in terms of what I think could have happened and what actually did. So number one, we need to understand what that means. Now, if we're saying it is not only unwanted and undesired, it was undesired, but it is also illegitimate, then we have to sort of figure out what the rules are. What is it that Herb Dean, who's otherwise one of the better refs, and I think, universally that's agreed upon, although, not everybody's going to get it right every time, and not everybody's going to like what everybody does every time. A lot of people are waiting to sort of throw him overboard after this fight, and I, for one, think that he got it right. So the actual rules, let's bring this up. So if we look at the different ways that a fight could end by submission, you have three options. You have the tap out, which is somebody physically tapping out. You have the verbal tap out, which is obviously somebody saying that they don't want to continue. Either they're yelling tap or they're just saying, no mas, whatever the case is. But technical submission is what this finish would fall under. And this is from the unified rules of MMA. It is something that the refs are trained in. It is the criteria by which they are making their decisions. And the technical submission says, when a legal submission act results in unconsciousness or broken/dislocated bones and or joints, right? So let's get back here. So first off, we're looking at this fight, and this is the end of the first round, and you could see Robbie Lawler's right hand. Now, Robbie Lawler's right hand is engaged. It is on Askren's head. It is pressuring him down. During this transition, obviously, Lawler went to, we call it a no-gi clock in my school. It's been called a bulldog choke. It can be called a regular, headlock. One of the things that I believe Dominic Cruz, who is one of my favorite, if not my favorite commentator on the actual fights, one of the things I think he got wrong is he was saying Lawler's chin was in there, therefore it wasn't a choke. The phrase I think he used, it wasn't in the blood or on the blood. And his phrasing aside, you can absolutely get choked unconscious with your chin caught in this choke, as you could a rear naked. So maybe that's a little bit of a lack of understanding there, but I've seen it happen. I've had it happen to me. I've done it to other people. It's something that, happens quite often actually in no-gi with somebody putting their chin down in a rear naked. It's very similar. So the fact that his chin was in, and I don't know whether it was in or not, really doesn't, determine whether or not, again, Herb Dean can say he's not unconscious because his chin is in. That's not one criteria that he would be using to make that decision. So now, moving on, we look at, he has what looks to be a choke. Ironically, I think it was Milicic who got caught with one of these by Carlos Newton back in UFC. I don't even know, back in the Stone Age of the UFC, which is kind of ironic given that Robbie Lawler used to be on Team Milicic. Shout out to Team Milicic, except Matt Hughes, who apparently is a douchebag. Has come out. He's gone through some trouble. But I'm going to fast forward this or play this, and we see, bam. So not only does his hand drop, but I want you to see how the hand drops and what it sort of turns into as it drops. It does not post strongly. It is not open-handed. He is not grabbing something. The hand, or the arm rather, doesn't look like it's on. It looks like it's turned off, as in he is unconscious. That is what it looks like, right? It drops. Now, here's Herb Dean. Now, Herb Dean had the same angle that we're looking at. He's much closer. He is taking in probably much more information than the camera that can pick up from where we are, from our vantage point. He's hearing them. He's watching them. He's looking at other things that maybe aren't on screen. And then he makes a move towards the hand. He doesn't like the result, and he stops Askren, right? So we repeat this again. It falls down. It's a little bit limp. So now, for a second, let's go back to the rules. Technical submission. When a legal submission act results in unconsciousness or broken dislocated bones. So we're going to go with, obviously, a legal submission. The choke that's on right now is a legal choke, and it results in unconsciousness. Now, it sort of begs the question, and I'm not sort of banking my whole argument on this point, but worth raising is, if consciousness occurs and then the person regains consciousness, does that still meet the criteria by which a referee could stop the fight? According to the rules, verbatim, it does. So if somebody's saying that, well, he was out, but then he came back awake, that is still grounds for the fight being stopped. Now, those of you, I'm a jiu-jitsu black belt, have been for over 10 years. I've been running a school over 15 years. I know that when somebody first comes out of a choke, they are not themselves. They are vulnerable. It adds to another criteria, which I don't have the image of a fight being stopped when another fighter cannot intelligently defend himself. So if you are unconscious and you regain consciousness, it could be argued at that point in time, in that state, you are not able to intelligently defend yourself. So that's yet another box that is checked that argues that Herb Dean did the right thing. Right meaning legal, legitimate, by the rules. Right? Herb Dean does not make the rules, he just enforces them. So now we're going to forward through this, and you see it, he checks. Now this is another angle, right? So this second angle here, again, you see the hand drop, and it is loose, it is limp, it is not bearing weight. Now here is a point that I brought some more attention to. I think I double up on this image. Look at the way Lawler's hand reacts. One of the guys I was discussing with one of my students today in class, or one of my students being a black belt, he said, well, when he grabbed his arm, his arm, stayed there. That is completely possible, even if you are unconscious from a choke or what I call the you can call it the purgatory or the vestibule of consciousness. How like a building, you go into it, it has that little vestibule, where there's that little vestibule where you're almost out, and then you go out, and then you come back into the vestibule before you're completely out. You don't know what the hell's going on. It's happened to a lot of us. I know you guys understand. Well, he could be in that point and still have his arm on in some capacity, right? And there's the argument that he's not in a position to intelligently defend himself. But he does not grab anything. He does not give the impression, the reaction that he uses with his arm when Herb Dean grabs it is not one that is giving the argument that he's okay. And this second angle gives us that information. So look at his hand start to sort of grab something that isn't there, right? I think there's one more close-up I put here. He grabs it, and it is looking to scoop the air. And it is at that point that Herb Dean decides to stop it. So do I think it was a legitimate stop? Absolutely. I mean, everybody was looking forward to this fight. Everybody knew, Lawler was a terrible matchup for Askren, and Askren was going to have his work cut out for him. But I think, if you are Lawler, and again, I'm a big fan of Lawler and have been for some time, you do not allow your hand to go limp. right? You do not allow your arm to go limp. You have to understand that, like, I'm when I fought, and I've only had 2 professional fights, so it's not like I had this huge career. But coaching over 10 years as I have, when I get a takedown, I'm a grappler, right? First and foremost, I know that if there's a position, whether it was me or one of my guys, that there was no action, I know that the ref's going to stand us up. I know that the ref's going to separate us. So that's looming in my mind. Very similarly, if you are in a submission, and there are a few people who have as much experience as Robbie Lawler does, not only in terms of fight, but the sort of length of his career so far, he has to know that he is on the clock right there. He has to know that he is caught in a legitimate position. Any reaction is going to lend itself to how it's going to be interpreted, and he's at risk of having the fight stopped. Now, an argument that was put out there was, well, it's not on Robbie Lawler to legitimize the fact that he's okay. Well, okay, and I agree with that, but I don't think that played any role in the decision that was made. Herb Dean did a check and, to his satisfaction, concluded that Robbie Lawler was either unconscious and or unable to intelligently defend himself, and he stopped the fight. You have to see. I have to ask. So, if I'm somebody who is caught in a submission in a fight, and I go limp just because I want to sort of relax my body or maybe I want to trick my opponent into thinking that I'm unconscious, so he lets go. And as soon as I do that, the ref stops the fight. If I were to come awake and go, wait a minute, no, I wasn't unconscious, is that a bad stoppage then? Some would argue, of course not, because you were trying to trick him. Well, how does intent play itself out when it comes to how a referee is supposed to make a decision based on the stoppage? He cannot go by intent. He has to go by his interpretation of what he sees, his experience. He sort of processes that, and he comes out with a conclusion that is congruent with the rules. Now, if there was something that happened here that we could look up in a rule book and say, hey, he fucked that up, he's not supposed to do that, he's not allowed to do that, it'd be a different story. But as it comes right now, as it pertains to this fight, Robbie Lawler, he done fucked up. He done fucked up. Now, we could have the argument, well, what would have happened afterwards? Ben Askren, I wasn't going to let go of that thing. He wouldn't have got out anyway. It's moot at this point. It's not. I don't even think it's worth really debating. But to go through this again, limp arm, failed the one test that Herb Dean wanted to give him, stopped the fight, right? Look at that arm. You cannot do that and expect a referee to assume that you're okay. Even if he held on to the head. Look at that. You do not go from using that hand, right? Using that hand to do something, to allowing it to fall limp. Then he grabs your hand and it looks like you're trying to grab, some imaginary gremlin or something. It's just not the thing that sort of supports the argument that the stop was not legitimate or it should not have occurred. I think it was unfortunate. I think it was undesired. I think in hindsight, it's like, man, I wish this fight would have continued and it didn't end like this. But I'm sorry, Ben Askren did his job. Herb Dean did his job. Robbie Lawler did not do his job to the best of his ability. He should know at this point that if you are not legitimately going unconscious, then you have to make sure everything that you are doing does not support the case that you are, right? Or, and I think this is worth, mentioning, Robbie Lawler, was bullshitting and he was out. It's worth considering. Robbie Lawler is a warrior by MMA terms, right? If we say in MMA, who would we consider to be a warrior? Robbie Lawler might as well be the picture in the dictionary. But all that being said, we also know that he's not going to want to quit. We know that he's not a bitch. He's not scared of anybody. He's not running from anybody. It's how he's lived his career. And getting into a choke, having it stopped, realizing that this whole thing is over, and protesting because you don't want it to be, like, it's understandable. Robbie Lawler, also a gentleman, very quickly after he protested, like, basically, I don't know what he said, but he made amends with Herb Dean, and he was a gentleman after that, as he always is, and it was unfortunate. I'm a big Robbie Lawler fan, but Askren took this one, and legitimately. I'm Justin Garcia, also known as Master Chim. You can watch The Pressure Project podcast, which is at thepressureproject.com. Hear me and my mouth a little bit more. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you just subscribe, hit the little bell and all that stuff. And I talk about a lot of things, sometimes MMA. All right, guys, be well. Talk to you soon. And as always, pressure to power.